Hey guys, welcome to the Monthly Coaching Club Masters Series. We are very, very fortunate to have my friend Laura Vanderkam join us. As you guys will recall from last week and other sessions that we've done, you can feel free to drop questions down there in the chat. Feel free to actually use this Q&A session. I've got a bunch of questions to ask Laura as well, but we want this to be interactive. Part of the advantage of the Monthly Coaching Club is that you get access to experts like this. But I'm actually not going to introduce Laura. I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about herself and her awesome books. You guys know that I fangirl about Laura. And she has a new book coming out that we were talking about just before we hopped on the call here, called Off the Clock, Feel Less Busy While Getting More Done, which, seeing the attendees that we have on the call right now and knowing who is going to watch the recording, I know that all of you would like to feel less busy and get more done, probably like the rest of us. So Laura, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about kind of your history in time management and your expertise, and then we'll hop right in.
Sure. So I'm Laura. I've written several time management and productivity books. I Know How She Does It was the most recent one, one called What the Most Successful People Do Before Breakfast. There you go. And one called 168 Hours. And as Alyssa said, I have a new one coming out in May. I'll hold this up. It's backwards in my thing, but it's okay. This is what the cover looks like. It's called Off the Clock. It'll be out May 29. So favorite topic of mine, of course, because I really do feel like time, our hours are the building blocks of our lives, and whatever we're going to accomplish in our lives is going to be a result of how we spend our hours. So we should think about how we spend our hours, and we should try to spend them in a way that works for ourselves and the people we care about. I've been writing about time for probably about the last 10 years or so. Before that, I did a lot of random, I guess, journalism stuff and wrote for a bunch of different places. So came into this topic more from the journalism background than from being a productivity expert per se. But it was a topic that I was always interested in and that other people seemed to be willing to read. So the happy confluence of those things is why it's wound up becoming my topic.
Awesome.
And me personally, I live outside Philadelphia with my family, my husband and my 4 kids, and that's what I do with my time.
So all of you guys that think you're busy with 1 or 2 kids, now you've got Laura to talk to or to answer to, really. And so I am so excited to hop in with you today, Laura. So tell us about, we spent last week kind of talking about time management. We went over some of the practices that you've recommended in your books, such as tracking your time to better understand, okay, how are you spending your time? And many members of the Monthly Coaching Club have actually tracked their time either in the past or over this past week. So what sort of insights and trends do you oftentimes see when you're looking at these time studies from people, and kind of what do you recommend people do as they're tracking their time?
Yeah, whenever I'm talking with people or, working on a book or working with people, I always want people to keep track of their time. I love to have them keep track of their time for a week if they can. A few days is great, but a week is even better. And that is because if we're trying to spend our time better, it is very difficult to do so if we don't know where the time is going now. I mean, this is like a pretty obvious first step, and yet people don't want to do it for unknown reasons, really. I think, we have these blocks about, well, I know where the time is going. I don't need to diagnose this. So, well, maybe you do. Maybe you do, but it's also possible that you don't. And so we need to make sure we know where the time is going so we can know if we're changing the right things. Because it's possible that something you thought was a problem actually isn't. Like maybe you're devoting quite a bit of time to something that you thought you weren't devoting time to. It's also possible that something you think takes a lot of time in your life isn't, and you'd like to put more time into it. So we want to make sure that we have good data before we make decisions. I find that there's certain stories that do tend to percolate to the top more frequently than others. A lot of people have a certain number in their head for how many hours they are working. That number is based on the fact that they feel like they are working a lot, which may be true, but often that number does not actually match the number that they are actually working for a lot of reasons. One is that we have in our minds a picture of a typical week. which tends to be the week when we were most fully at work. But there really are no typical weeks. I mean, in nobody's mind does a typical week include the day you had a dentist appointment, or the day you were late to work because there was an accident on the freeway, or the day you had to cut out early on Friday for something. Like, in people's minds, that's not a typical week. And yet those things happen more often than not.
Yeah, they're more typical than
not. And so that's one thing affecting it. It's also human nature to sort of feel like things that, you know, maybe we don't always want to do take more time than the things that we do want to do. So that's another thing that increases the work number in our minds. And also, we live in a competitive culture. Like, if your colleagues are all talking about their 70-hour work weeks, you're not going to be like, listen, dude, I work 46 hours. I know that. You know, you'll be like, oh yeah, my 70-hour work weeks too. So that is one that happens fairly frequently. And I have done it too. Just to put that out there, I was under the impression that I worked about 50 hours a week, because I, in fact, have tracked my time. And the weeks I had tracked over the years, I'd always worked about 50 hours a week. Then I started tracking my time continuously about 3 years ago, just as, you know, I'm a time management freak. I knew I could write about it. That's why I did that. I discovered that in the past, I had chosen very specific weeks to track, which were weeks when I worked 50 hours a week, because I wanted to see myself that way. When I tracked all my time, of course, that couldn't happen. The average was a lot closer to 40. 40 is a different number than 50. So I was doing it too. There one that I think often happens a lot with people too is sort of the flip side of that, which is that we tell ourselves we have no leisure time whatsoever. And often what this means is that we do have leisure time. It's just not as much as we want. But not as much as I want is a very different story from none. So, and I think not as much as I want is a more practical and useful story to tell ourselves, because then we can say, okay, well, where could I find some more time for the things that I want to do? Or are there ways I can get through this period of life where I only have a little bit of leisure time to get me to the point where I will have more leisure time? But telling ourselves there's none is sort of defeatist, and in general is not true. I mean, you have people who'll be like, yeah, I have no time for myself, and then can tell you about something that happened on Big Bang Theory last week. And you're like,
you're like, I'm pretty sure that's time for yourself.
That's time. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's really interesting. I think that is kind of the common theme that you see across really anyone, an adult or these days even children, that feel like they don't have time to do the things that they want to do. And I want to kind of transition that, because I get a lot of people kind of push back on me and say, you know, I like being spontaneous. I like kind of flying by the seat of my pants sometimes. And I can still be productive while I do it. And based on a lot of your writing, I kind of argue the opposite. And I say, you know, if you are more regimented about your time, you'll actually give yourself more free time and more leisure time. So tell us a little bit about kind of the data behind that and why that is the case.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously there's people who prefer to plan and people who prefer not to plan, and more, serendipitous types. And that could be a wonderful personality trait. It's often less useful in terms of making progress on various goals if you also have a very busy life. I mean, if you don't have a whole lot of responsibilities with your job, you have very set hours, you don't have young kids, for instance, then sure. I mean, it could work to be spontaneous, but if those don't apply to your life, then it might behoove you to be a bit more said, well, you know, I'm going to at least think through my time to say, these are the things I'd like to do. This is roughly when it could happen. These are the logistical things that need to occur in order for me to get this done. And that's true for work stuff. Like, I mean, even spontaneous sorts, like, they have their sitter come at 8 a.m. because they need to leave for work. They're not like, oh, show up whenever you want, right? Like, no, right. You know, you have to make that happen. And so it's because that's something that, you know, you need to get done. And so it's the same thing with other aspects of your life. You know, if you have a partner, for instance, and you're raising young kids on the weekends, it's not going to be like, okay, now is a great time for me to exercise. It's like, except it's also right in the middle of like the soccer game and the birthday party. And, you know, we had to get the car to the repair shop before it closed at 5 and all this other stuff. But if you think through the weekend ahead of time, you could say, okay, well, I know if I go for a run at 7 a.m., I can run for an hour and a half. My partner would be okay with covering that morning if I cover for him the next day. So then I've got my long run in, and we can do the birthday party and the soccer game and getting the car to the shop. And so you get to do the stuff that you want to do. And I think often what happens when people are like, oh, you just can't do X when you have a family, or you can't do Y when you have a really demanding job, it is because these people do not want to think through their time ahead of it.
Right, right. Well, so that makes sense. So let's talk about when you're kind of planning with the best of intentions. And I think this is most of us. I know it's been me, where I start my day and I have, you know, the best of intentions where I'm following my plan, and then I get off track. And getting off track is sort of kind of everybody's kryptonite because it takes so long to get back on track. Do you have any tips for people to get back on track when that sort of thing happens, or kind of I don't know, like limitations or kind of warning signs that you might be getting off track, sort of thing?
Well, I think what happened, I mean, it's the nature of life that stuff comes up, right? And so partly when you're getting off track, it's because something urgent came in that you need to deal with. And so if you recognize that that is the reality of how time happens, that stuff comes in, then you can plan around that. You can say, well, I'm only going to fill maybe half of my work time on any given day because I know that stuff will come up. And so if I'm planning on being at the office for, let's say, 9 hours, I know I'm going to have an hour of breaks somewhere or the other, because that's, again, just human nature. People can think they aren't taking breaks, but they are. I'm going to say I'm only going to schedule 4 hours of meetings because I know that things will happen. And I want to be able to deal with those things. They may be emergencies. They may be bad things. They may be wonderful opportunities that come up. But either way, it's stuff that wasn't there before. And so you need to limit the amount you're asking yourself to do on any given day, so you have the mental space to deal with these things. So I find that that is probably the best way to deal with this, because you aren't really off track if your track allowed for other things to come up. Now, if more stuff has come up than you ever, than the 4 hours that you left open for it, or, for whatever reason, the stuff just didn't happen right for the day. You can always do with the workday what I call kind of a 4 p.m. triage, which is basically an hour and a half before you plan to leave the office. Really hunker down and say, well, what actually needs to get done today? So yes, I got off track. Maybe not everything that I wanted to get done today will get done, but what absolutely has to get done before tomorrow, focus on that. And then you can deal with the rest on some other day, because you will be back. Most stuff doesn't actually have to get done immediately. So you'll come back the next day and deal with it then.
Absolutely. So I do have one question about these breaks that you mentioned. So I've read in tons of different articles and books that breaks are actually a good thing because your mind kind of needs to reset. And I think in sort of this rat race kind of mentality that so many of us have, we'll finish a task a few minutes early and then we'll jump right into our next task. Is that a good idea? Is it a bad idea? If it's a bad idea, why?
Well, I would argue that people aren't actually jumping into their next task. What I've noticed is that people build a lot of mental breaks into their lives. They just don't think of it as such. So when you're doing one thing and then you switch over to your phone and you look at your email real quick, but then you start looking at other stuff, right? You're like over on social media, or you're reading either headline sites, or maybe you check your stocks. I don't know, you're like really excited to get out of your job, so you're checking where your portfolio is. But people have this stuff that they do, and those are breaks, right? It's just they aren't actually that relaxing. And so that's kind of the problem with it, is when you don't give your brain real breaks, it takes fake ones. And so you're better off kind of saying, okay, I know I will not be able to focus straight through 8 hours a day. If I know that, where can I sort of proactively build in breaks to my schedule that will work best for me and will most energize myself? So for many people, what a good proactive break schedule would be like one break mid-morning, which, you go refill your coffee or something, but, go talk to a work friend or whatever. An actual lunch, meaning that you're not just shoveling salad into your mouth at your desk, like actually get up and either eat somewhere else, or if you do want to eat at your desk, you're going for a walk, or you're getting some physical activity in or something. And then a mid-afternoon break, like if you think of tea time or something like that, which again, if you can get some fresh air, if you can do something that energizes you during just a short break in the afternoon. And what that enables is focus during times that are very easy to lose. I know a lot of people around 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they start rereading the same email over and over. They get distracted by stuff. Like our next thing they know, they've been looking at photos on Facebook of people from high school that they did not like anyway. And it's like 45 minutes have gone by, and you didn't care about that person in high school. You really don't care now. And so it's like, stop.
Yeah.
Do a real break, plan in a real break. You will get so much more done. If it's this lying to ourselves that we don't need breaks and we take fake ones, as you would have been better off taking a real break because it could have been shorter and would have done more for you.
Right. And I mean, I think that is a lie that not only we all tell ourselves, but we all at some point believe that, our brain is not going to take those breaks. But the reality is, no matter what you tell yourself, your brain is forcing itself to take the break.
Yeah. I mean, if you just think about it, your body takes breaks too. I mean, I know I have to get up to go to the bathroom at various points during the day. I mean, like nobody is working straight through. All right. And so once you know that, you can say, I'm going to plan my breaks more intelligently so that they work best for me.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, you've focused a lot of your time management on kind of the effective use of mornings, and actually using your practices. Last year, I was able to lose 25 pounds because I kind of harnessed my mornings.
Wow. Good for you.
Thank you. But it was one of those things where I realized I can only create a habit in the morning. That's just who I am. And obviously it's so much easier to create habits in the morning because you can kind of keep the outside world outside and not let them in yet. But what do you suggest for somebody that's maybe like a night owl?
Yeah.
And, they're just not really that morning person, but they're really effective at night.
Well,
or think they are.
I mean, if that's true and it works for you and you're doing the great stuff that you want to be doing in the evening, more power to you. I think when people are often asking that question, it's because they're not doing the stuff that they want to do. And so then I think we need to look at this. It's possible that somebody is a night owl. And the way to know is if you're really doing your best work at night. Like if you are, writing that great American novel at night, if you are able to solve your most important business challenges late at night, then yes, you are a night owl. For most people who call themselves night owls, it's more that they're tired in the morning. And the reason they're tired in the morning is that they
stay up all night.
Yeah, for the time that they have to get up. But if they're looking at what they were doing in the evening, it was not writing the great American novel. It was, again, being on Facebook, Instagram, like watching TV, puttering around the house, stuff that is sort of effortlessly pleasurable, but is not really doing that much for you, in terms of your long-term happiness. So for many of those people, it might be effective to try going to bed a little bit earlier. Just give yourself a bedtime, whatever amount of sleep you need before you need to wake up in the morning. Think about what sort of small morning routine steps you could do to help build these habits that you want. Whether it's, I'm going to just exercise for 15 minutes a couple days a week, or I'm going to, try to write 500 words in my novel 4 days a week. It doesn't actually have to be every day, but, just a couple days a week, do this thing in the morning and see how that works for you. And it is easier for many people to build a habit in the morning. Now, again, if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. I mean, there are plenty of people who have built a habit of exercising at lunch, or exercising after work, or exercising 2 nights a week and then on weekends. Or there are people who write the great American novel on their lunch breaks, or, it doesn't have to be mornings. It's just that for most people, mornings are most convenient because, as you said, you can keep out the world and get your stuff done. If you do have very small children who wake up unpredictably, it may be harder to get your mornings for these various things.
Just life is harder.
Life is harder. And the good news is they do grow up. So you just sort of give yourself a break for a little bit and get back to the morning routine in a year or two.
Absolutely. So what I loved about your book about actual mornings, what most successful people do before breakfast, you really did a lot of case studies and shared with us some great stories of some great habits that people are creating in the mornings. Can you share some of those with us of, particularly interesting people that are doing really productive things in the morning?
Yeah, well, I interviewed a bunch of people. In fact, I mean, the most common one was, of course, exercising. And almost always when you meet somebody who has a huge job, they are also like raising a family or doing amazing things in their community. If they are also exercising, it is almost universally in the morning, because that is the only time it can happen. And they know that, and they want to exercise, so they do. So, there are definitely like executives I interviewed are like, well, I get up and I run a couple miles every morning, and that is what I do. It doesn't have to be that. There were people who worked on, that maybe their main job was not the thing they ultimately wanted to be doing, or at least wasn't perfectly matched with what they wanted to be doing. And so they used that morning time to create more of the career that they wanted. I think one lady said to me, during the day I have a job, in the morning I have a career. And I thought that was a pretty good insight, that she was going to use that time to direct her career to the way she wanted. So, we think of it as personal time in the morning, and certainly can be for exercise, spiritual pursuits, or even hanging out with your family, right? Like a family breakfast could be a great option for families that can't necessarily do dinner together. But it could be work related too, but whatever it is, it needs to be the things that are important to you that life has a way of crowding out.
Right. Yeah. I oftentimes talk about the important but not urgent things, because the urgent things will get done whether you like it or not. But the important things we often just kind of put to the back burner. So that's really great insight. So I'm curious, emails and our phones really have kind of taken over this idea of productivity for many of us. I'm curious what you think, and obviously this is a broad brushstroke question, but in terms of checking email, we all feel kind of this constant need to be glued to our phones and constantly checking email. When you're doing kind of your interviews with a lot of these really productive, high producing people, how frequently are they checking email? They're clearly not tied to their inboxes the way that we think we need to be. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies from person to person. I do know that some people are more glued to their inboxes than others, and there may be successful people who are on their email all the time and people who aren't. I think in general with life, it's best to recognize that email is a tool to do your job. It is not very frequently our actual job itself, and so once you recognize that email will expand to fill all available space, then you recognize that it is a choice how much time you are going to devote to it. And if you feel you are not creating enough space for other things that you would like to do, then it might behoove you to choose to give email less time. So for many people, what that looks like is saying, I'm going to check a couple times a day. Like I'm going to check an hour. Well, okay. Practically for many people, like you check before you go to work, because you want to make sure like if your 9 a.m. meeting was canceled, but then hopefully you can get like that first block of productive time where you're really dug deep into something, not checking the email. Maybe take a little bit of time to deal with any of the morning emails, maybe a little bit of time after lunch, a little bit of time later in the day. 4 or 5 times a day should cover it for most people. Like it's very hard to imagine some, people who couldn't wait 2 or 3 hours for a response. If you're in a kind of job where people absolutely can't for unknown reasons wait for 2 to 3 hours, okay. But I mean, the point, you could be on a plane. I mean, you could be driving somewhere. You could be like, there's all kinds of reasons you wouldn't answer an email for 2 to 3 hours. So I think for most people that would work fine. Some people manage to do it once a day, and that's great. But sort of you can figure out what works for you, but consciously choose the amount of time you're going to devote to it.
Absolutely. So talking a little bit about that, in terms of when we start to schedule ourselves, what I've had feedback from a lot of folks with is they're trying to be present in whatever activity that they are. But after they start tracking their time, they're scheduling their time and they're struggling with feeling present in their current moment, because they're so conscious of their time that they're worried about the next appointment. Do you have any feelings or tips on that, of kind of how we can be more present?
Well, one idea is to take it out of your conscious mind and like use tools to help you know when it's time to move to the next thing. I've seen people who have a lot of meetings will just set a timer on their alarm, set a watch alarm or, you know, a phone alarm or something like that. And that way they don't have to look at their watch. They don't have to look at their clock during a meeting. They just fully focus on the person in front of them. When the alarm goes off, it's like, oh, I guess we only have 10 more minutes. You know, it's like, but it wasn't you paying attention to that. It was, so you were fully focused. You weren't constantly looking at the clock. So that's certainly one thing you can do, is that every time you need to make a transition, you set some sort of external reminder so that you personally don't have to keep track of it.
I love that. And then, okay, so time in between meetings. There are time in between meetings. This was something that was really powerful for me when I started to track my time, because I would find like these small little windows that I could be more productive. And it took a lot of preparing for me. But before that, I oftentimes, like in between meetings, would just default to my inbox, which is why time went off the rails. So what sort of things do you recommend trying to slide into those small windows? How do you make the most of your time in between meetings, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, so email is, of course, the default, because it's like, ooh, look at me. I managed to delete 12 emails in my time between meetings. Like, great. So what, right? I think that there's a couple things you can do. I mean, you can think about squeezing in a little bit of extra personal time if you wanted to. I mean, certainly a 5-minute spot is enough to do a quick like meditation. You have ebooks on your phone. You could read a couple pages in a novel during that time. I've been sort of, you know, obviously I work from home, so this is slightly easier for me. But when I have a 30-minute break between calls, like if I have a couple of 30-minute breaks during the day, I'll often like put on my exercise clothes, or at least like exercise clothes from the waist down. So if I have video calls, but then, you know, as soon as one is over, I go out, I run for 20 minutes, come back, like have another call, go out for another 20 minutes later and come back. And, you know, it's a big workout. It's just, it's broken up into little spaces. But otherwise those 20-minute chunks would just go to email, and then I wouldn't have gotten my run in. So that's something I do. I've also found, you know, I've got a new habit I'm doing of trying to write 500 words of fiction every day during the week. So at least 2,500 words a week, but in 500 words a day. I write pretty fast. Like, you know, they're not good words, but they're words. And I can do that in 15 to 20 minutes. So when I have a break between things, I can knock that out. And that's been kind of good for me to see. Like, it really, a lot of stuff really doesn't take that much time. If you think about it, you know, you could use that time for like planning your weekend. You could use that time for thinking through some personal goals. You might, you know, text a friend to see how she's doing. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do with little bits of time that are probably more productive in the grand scheme of things than deleting those emails.
Absolutely. So you mentioned weekends, so I would be remiss to not ask you about weekends. So what about this kind of elusive time off? How can we actually, one, take time off, and two, use it effectively?
Yeah. So I think, you know, the issue with weekends is the same as with any time. We can either be intentional about it or we can not be intentional about it. And I think it's the lack of intentionality that makes people be unhappy with how they are spending their time. There's nothing wrong with working on the weekend if you choose to do that, or if you need to do that sometimes. But if you're going to, why don't you say, okay, here are the set times I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to be off the rest of the time. So let's say you've looked at what you actually have to get done by Monday. You've recognized that you have about 4 hours of stuff that has to happen over the weekend before Monday. Like, you can let that dribble in throughout Saturday and Sunday and just be miserable that you're constantly connected. Or you can say, okay, I'm going to take 2 hours on Saturday morning and do it. And I'm going to take 2 hours on Sunday night and do it. And between Saturday morning and Sunday night, I'm off. And that's still a fair amount of time. And that could feel quite good. You know, you got your work done and you got your time off. Best of both worlds. You know, I think it's also about thinking through, what are things I could do that would add to my energy levels? What often happens is that people get to the weekend and they've been so busy during the week, they think, I just want to do nothing. But it is impossible to do nothing. Like, you'll do something, but it might not be as rejuvenating as what you would have done if you had put a little bit more thought to it. And especially if you are living with other people, then whatever they sort of are going to do or not going to do is going to influence what you're able to do. And so you'll, again, wind up doing stuff and then be like, well, I never got to do the things I wanted to do. We did what everyone else wanted to do, or we fought over what we were going to do. You know, these are the kinds of things that can be avoided if, like, you think through it ahead of time, ask other people what they would like to do, have a conversation about it, come up with a rough schedule, and then try to follow it as much as possible. And so, a couple days ahead of time, think about like, well, what 3 things could I do on the weekend that would add to my energy levels? Doesn't have to be elaborate. I mean, it could be that you want to go for a bike ride with a friend, you want to have dinner with your spouse, you want to go to worship services, you want to volunteer somewhere, whatever it is. But those 3 things, make sure they happen. And then you'll hit Monday feeling so much more like you had a good weekend and you're ready to go.
Absolutely. So I suspect, and actually I know a little bit from reading in your books, but I suspect that with 4 kids, you have the need to delegate a decent amount. And I think as a parent myself, I think delegation can be difficult both professionally and personally. So talk a little bit about delegation as just a concept in general, and then kind of why it can boost our productivity so much, and what that would look like both professionally and personally.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in life, it's just important to realize that you are one person and there are only 24 hours in a day. And so you cannot do sort of absolutely everything out there. And that's not just a matter of how hardworking you are, how dedicated you are. I mean, it's just like physics, right? You can't do 28 hours of stuff in 24 hours a day. It's just not impossible. And things take a certain amount of time. And so it's again about being sort of rational and making sure we're having accurate data as we're trying to, plan our lives. And at work, you think about it, if you're working at a big company or you're like running a big company, nobody would be like, oh, well, the CEO of Pepsi isn't successful because she has other people doing things. Well, of course, like you can't run a big company by yourself. Like that doesn't even make sense. Like nobody would even think that. And it's the same thing if you are, just have a smaller sort of business thing you're running, or even the business of a, large and busy household. I think that's the first thing to think about, and then say, well, given that I absolutely cannot do everything, what are the things that I think are most important for me to do? Again, what I personally think are most important for me to do, not listening to some larger narrative of what we believe in life, a good woman, a good mother, a good wife, a good worker, whatever it does, but whatever we think is most important for us to do. And then how do we make sure we do that, and that the other things are given to somebody that we trust to do a good job on it?
Absolutely. So one of the exercises that you have recommended in your books that I've done, and I actually have my kids do it too, except they didn't come up with 100 things. They came up with like 5. But they were really young when I had them do it. Now I'm thinking I'm going to revisit it probably this summer with them. But this list of 100 dreams, and kind of the concept. Talk to us a little bit about the concept behind it and why it's a pretty good exercise. And even for the parents on the call, I think it's useful to understand why it might be useful for your kids too.
Well, the 100 Dreams is, here's all the things I would like to do more of with my time in life. I think often people assume they have no time, so they haven't really thought about what they'd like to do with it. And if you haven't thought about it, it's hard to sort of in the moment come up with like, oh, it's Saturday. We could go for that day trip to that, national park that's 3 hours away. We've kept saying we want to do and we haven't. So I think having a list of stuff you think would be fun, interesting, exciting, meaningful is great. And, you're not beholden to any of this. You don't have to cross all of it off, but it just gives you an idea of things that might be interesting that you might want to try. It can change over life. You may try some of these things and decide like that was awful. I never want to do it again. Good to know. Now you are no longer thinking about it. Like, you can just let that one go, not try to put it into your life ever again. But, it helps with planning things like vacations. It helps with thinking about your career. Like if there's certain things that would be goals for you professionally, you can start saying, oh, well, if I do want to write a book someday, what do I need to do to make that happen? Or if I would like to run my own business someday, I can start thinking about what would that be like? So just having this very, very long list, which is the reason it's long is so you're not editing yourself. Because a lot of times people are like, oh, well, that's stupid. I don't want to put that down. Well, if you're trying to get to 100, You got to put it down.
Just put everything.
It's really hard to get to 100.
Yes. I don't think I've made it to, I think I'm at like somewhere in the 60s now.
Yeah. And so that's great. Like I would say it is hard to get all the way to 100, but that's kind of the point. Cause then you can keep coming back to it and keep saying, oh, well, here's this other thing that would be cool. And then you're in the mindset of thinking about it. And that's a very productive mindset to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Those of you guys that are parents, it's useful for me because it's actually one of the reasons I know a lot of you on the call saw that Lynn and I took the kids and we swam with the dolphins at Atlantis. It's one of the reasons we knew that that was something they really wanted to do. Was Sunny had told me how she wanted to swim with the dolphins, and it wasn't a question I had ever asked before. And when she was 6, I didn't think it was something on her mind. So I think that that's something important, and you really do learn a whole lot about not just yourself, but other things people in your family want to do. And it's a great way to come up, I've found, with activities where most of the time we're saying, hey, what do you want to do? And the answer is, I don't know. What do you want to do?
Yeah, I think it might be best for slightly older children. I mean, that's wonderful that your 6-year-old was self-aware enough to know that what she wanted to do. I mean, I've tried asking sort of younger kids to think about what the problem is. Their frame of reference is not that big. Like they don't know what's out there. They don't actually know that there's like a cool park 2 hours away, and they're not going to get on the internet and find it. Like they you know, so on some level, I mean, you can do some of the initial research and like have a list of things like, let me tell you about this. Why don't you tell me of this, what you think sounds most cool? And then as they get older, if you've got children who are more like 10 to, teenagers, that's probably the sweet spot for figuring out what they would like to do. And hopefully then they feel a little bit more invested in family trips as well.
Yeah, we're going to revisit the list. Don't worry. So I think kind of a common theme that we all sort of struggle with is this feeling of kind of putting people off. How do you sort of mentally get okay with saying, no, I'm carving this time out either for me or for the tasks at hand, as opposed to being responsive in a world where we're kind of taught, or at least feel like we need to be responsive?
Yeah, I mean, you can just say no.
Right.
That's life. And I think it helps to have most of this work happening in your head. I mean, the no can be pretty straightforward. Thank you for thinking of me. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to take this on. Best of luck with your project. Okay. Very straightforward. If you know somebody else you can recommend, that's great. But if it's truly something you don't want to do, it may not be something that other person wants to do either. So you have to be careful with that. I think most of the mental work of no is happening in our own heads. And so getting ourselves to the no, there's a couple things we need to remember. One is that we often say yes to things more like the farther they are in the future, because it's hard to get our heads around, like, we are going to be our same person in the future. So when you're assigning something like, oh yeah, August me could do that. Like August me won't be busy. Sure. August me. Yeah. We'll say yes to that then. But like in August, you're actually going to be just the same person you are now. And you have just as much going on. And so I think a better mental trick for people to think about this is ask yourself, would I do this tomorrow? Like whatever you're being asked to do, ask yourself if you would do it tomorrow. Obviously your schedule is packed tomorrow. You already have all this stuff going on. So it's more a question of like, well, would you be tempted to move things around? Would you be trying to cancel things to like make this new opportunity fit in? And if you would, like, you will be just as excited in August. Like you are going to be the same person again, like, great. Take it on. If you're sitting there saying like, yeah, no, I would never say yes to this tomorrow, then probably you should say no to it for August as well. It also might help to remember that when you are saying yes to something, things will come up, and your yes will then require you to say no to other things. And it is possible that you'll be saying no to things that you would have preferred to do. And so you probably should only say yes to things in the future that are yes. Like, I'm very excited about this because I know this is, I think I took this from Greg McKeown. I think that's how you say his name. His book Essentialism. He says, like, if it's not a 9 or 10, it's a no. Don't say yes to 5 or 6 things, because something's going to come up that's a 7 or 8, and you'll want to do that. Yeah. You've already got this obligation to your 5 thing. And so you're going to be ticked off about it. So yes now means no to something else. And it's quite possible that no would be better. The thing you're saying no to would be better. So leave the space. And if you're not that excited about it.
I'm so much more honored that you said yes to this invitation now. Not that I wasn't before, but now it was a real yes. So one of the things that kind of reminds me is I was looking last night for an entirely different purpose at the Netflix culture deck, and they were talking about employees and essentially if you're a manager, if the employee were to say to you, I've decided I'm going to leave, would you fight for that person? And unless your answer is kind of without question, yes, then that person probably should just be offered a generous severance package at that point and be let go. It's not, you shouldn't keep people unless you're willing to fight for them. It's the same attitude with activities. Like you shouldn't take things on unless you're willing to fight for them, which I think I love that. So I'm curious, when you're making these tasks, we all kind of write our to-do list, unfortunately, in no particular order as it comes to mind. How do you go about prioritizing your tasks?
So in general, I mean, I have sort of major goals for the year. I kind of tend to assign them quarterly to myself, but I have big things that I know are the most important things I'm working on. Then I also set myself weekly priorities. So on Friday afternoon, I make myself a priority list for the next week. I figure out what it is that I need to do professionally, my most important tasks professionally. I also figure out my most sort of important personal and family tasks. And then I have that list and I can keep referring to that list again and again and again the whole week. And then I see, have I done it all by Friday? And if I haven't, like, obviously I need to figure out what I haven't done yet and get through that. So if you don't have those things named and in mind, like, it's a lot harder to do them. But if you have them named and you keep that list in front of you, and you front load the week as much as possible, then you will get through them and you will make progress on your goals.
Right. So we talk a lot about kind of this idea of multitasking, and I know multitasking is not really the most productive thing to do, but I've kind of looked at it in a different form of multitasking isn't always multitasking if you're not wholeheartedly involved in the task at hand. So I had a client actually send me a text on Tuesday when I was at guitar with our daughter and I was working on a presentation, and she was kind of giving me a little shit saying, "You're not supposed to multitask." I thought, "What are you doing?" And my point is, I'm not taking the guitar.
Yeah, you're not learning guitar.
Here. So how, like, that's useful, kind of using your time wisely.
I wouldn't even consider that multitasking. I would say, given the amount of time like parents spend doing kids activities, you better be figuring out how to use that time for something that's important to you. I mean, even if you want to watch every second of every single sports game or whatever, like, there's all this other time too, where they're just hanging around, like waiting for it to start, that, the lesson where obviously you're not getting the lesson, it's the kid. So during that time, read a book, work on your presentation, go for a walk.
Yes.
Use that time for something.
Okay, good. I needed to feel good about myself in that moment. So kind of speaking of our kids and the time we spend with them, mine are sort of getting to the age where I don't know that they want to really hang out with me as much as I would like to hang out with them. But I think as parents, we sometimes like beat ourselves up a little bit that we're not spending like all of our time with our family as well, or at least equal amount of time as we spend at work. And I think it's a kind of this powerful idea of when you're balancing your time, and part of why we struggle with this idea of striking a balance is because we're looking to strike a balance of actual hours spent. What do you think on that?
Well, first, I would say if you try tracking your time, you might be surprised that you are spending as much time with your children as you are at work. I have definitely noticed in some of my timelines that I'll be spending, 40 hours at work, 40 hours on family stuff. And I may not be completely unique in that. I think, you know, people are like, oh, I'm always at work. But it's like, well, you've got the time before work, you've got the time after work, you've got the whole weekend, you've got the extra time that kids wind up taking for stuff, that there's the doctor appointments, or you left early to go to something, or, you know, you were home on the snow day, you have holidays, like, you know, it adds up.
Absolutely.
Like if you work 2,000 hours a year, there's 8,760 hours in a year. You know, you're sleeping some chunk of that, but there's a big other chunk of time. And many people spend a lot of that with their family. So first, I would say, don't be so sure that the hours split the way you think they do. The reason people feel like they do spend more time on work than they do with families, that because work is more intentional. Like you show up at a certain time, you've assigned yourself the tasks, you know what you're doing, you know, are getting through this stuff. People don't do that with their other time. They don't say like, oh, well, I think tonight would be a great night to all go out for Sundays together, or we should think about taking a family walk after dinner, or maybe I could interest one of my kids in a game of, you know, some board game tonight. People aren't doing that. And so then the time feels as if it doesn't exist. But if you're more intentional about it, it can take the sort of same mental space as work does. And that makes it feel like it is more vast. As for kids not necessarily wanting to spend as much time with you, I mean, that's just life, right? The kids get older, and I think it's important to still have some opportunities where you are together. So especially as kids get older, it might be wise to start thinking about doing some of the driving for activities. Maybe in the past you had other people do that. It might be, you know, you might take over a little bit of it yourself as they get older, because that's often a time that children are willing to talk. Putting them to bed still, even if they're older, is also a good time, because again, it's the end of the day. They're more willing to sort of say, oh, this is what happened. You can have some really great conversations then. And, you know, with the weekends as well, sort of thinking about what activities they'd like to do and how you can do some of those, and going one-on-one when you can. Like if you have more than one kid, being able to spend some one-on-one time with a kid, again, it winds up being a little bit more of that quality time, even if there's, you know, some aspects of they don't always want to be with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, hopefully I'll keep them small, and they'll always want to
They'll always be small.
So kind of to wrap up here, do you have any like resources or apps or anything like that you recommend, or that you particularly love for time management?
The short answer is no. I really don't use many apps for things. And partly it's because apps make your phone more interesting. And I don't believe that the cause of time management is advanced by spending more time on your phone. I mean, I love Instagram as much as anyone. I look at the weather. I use the map apps. I, you know, have Uber, Lyft, whatever to get to places. But the problem with productivity apps is, you know, you don't just look at the productivity app. You look at that, and then you look at Instagram, and you look at whatever. So get your head out of your phone as much as possible. That said, I mean, I think there are certain things to do. I mean, some people like to track their time using apps. So that's, if you find a time tracking app that works well for you, you can use that. I just use a spreadsheet. If you want to go to my website, you can enter your email in the subscription form and I'll send you one. But, you know, for time tracking, so it's straightforward enough. You can just use something like that. It doesn't have to be a high-tech tool to figure out where the time is really going. So that's probably what I would use instead.
Absolutely. Well, Laura, thank you so much. I always enjoy talking to you. I know I could sit and talk to you most of the day, but I also know that we have very busy people looking to be productive with their day, so I don't want to take up too much time of theirs. But thank you so much for joining our little monthly Coaching Club Masters series. Guys, definitely check out her book. It's Off the Clock.
The next one, yeah, will be out in May, Off the Clock. So please pre-order it. That would be awesome.
We absolutely will. I look forward to checking it out, and thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Bye.